So what exactly do you do as a chief of staff? This perfectly normal question seems to come up every time you see your family, attend a networking event, or meet a new friend. And yet, it can be really stressful and difficult to answer. Your role is so complex and jam-packed with responsibilities and demands that sometimes your own job description seems, well, vague. I'm Catherine Berardi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Chief of Staff Collective podcast. In this episode, Caroline Pugh speaks with Ted Riter, an incredible coach who has worked with executives and chiefs of staff from around the globe. We discuss some of the social challenges that come with being a chief of staff, including the inevitable paradox of being both highly involved in every aspect of a business, but also experiencing isolation on the job. Moreover, we discuss what personal characteristics chiefs of staff have that allow them to thrive in the workplace. Here's our interview with Ted, the mental makeup of a chief of staff.
Today, we are with Ted Riter. He is someone that I got to know last year as an amazing coach. He's worked with executives at large organizations and small organizations all over the world, and now also delving into the world of chief of staff, getting to really understand both the work of a chief of staff and the obstacles behind a chief of staff, but also the psyche of a chief of staff. What are some of the emotional tolls that we have as individuals? And what is the actual mental makeup of a chief of staff, which can also be kind of complex and interesting to understand. So Ted, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Love talking with you always.
So, I wanted to specifically talk to you about your white paper. And I thought it was just so interesting. And obviously it was a huge hit. And the title of it is, It's Lonely Near the Top, Challenges for Chief of Staff. And it's hard not to ignore that title.
Good. The right title then.
I think it's a title that a lot of people, chief of staff, can immediately identify with. The role is obviously very lonely, and you are at the top. You're working with the principal, oftentimes the CEO, as well as the other C-suite executives. And, that only not holds a lot of responsibility, but a lot of pressure. And I think in your white paper, you really dissected, what is a chief of staff? What are the different functions of a chief of staff, whether it's a goalkeeper, operator, advisor to the CEO, but really talking through a lot of the challenges. And I want to get a better understanding of, first of all, how did you understand what the challenges of a chief of staff were? I mean, you talked to a bunch of people, but how did you start digging deep into what are the current day challenges behind a chief of staff?
Well, part of it was simply just being curious and getting to know these chiefs of staff. And I want to say right away that the chiefs I spoke with are so inspiring. And many were struggling, many were successful, but they were all inspiring in one way or another. So just through conversation, looking into, okay, this you love, and this you love, and this you love, and where's the pain? Where's the friction in this relationship or in this position?
So let's dive in. You started talking through those challenges that you found. And one of the first ones that you talk about are job descriptions and loneliness, which I personally identify with as well. And, going into the loneliness thing, we've been putting together these chiefs of staff events. And I think one of the reasons why people stay for 3 hours is because they're like, wow, I can finally talk to someone else about what it is that I do. And I don't feel lonely. There's all these other people who do the exact same thing that I do.
Exactly.
And it is so isolating because of a multitude of reasons. But I wanted for you to kind of dive in a little bit on, what is it that you found and how was it that you realized that loneliness is such a big factor? And I think there's also an element of, it's okay to feel lonely. It is a lonely role, right?
It certainly is a lonely role. And as chief of staff, it's someone who's near the top. And what I've learned with executives who are at the top is that that's a lonely role. And it was important for me to stress the word near the top because we forget people in this position are right up there. They're up there close enough to touch the top, but not own it on their own. And so there's feelings that are created around that distance right there. And then they also feel the distance from the rest of the staff. And the rest of the staff might be in the C-suite as well, or it might be, staff throughout an organization. And the sense was that no one quite understood what they were doing. when I asked for job descriptions from chiefs of staff, I got things like I'm the chief of everything that's not handled by someone else, or I'm the chief connector, I'm the chief, very vague things. And some of them had real specifics, but with so many specifics, it became a bit vague. And so just recognize that there was a little texture that people had that I picked up when speaking with them, of a longing to be understood, sometimes by the rest of the staff, sometimes by their family. Their family didn't even quite get it. Why aren't you coming home for dinner? We thought you were coming home for dinner and now your plans have changed. Or, oh, you get to do these glamorous things. It must be really amazing. And for the chief to say, well, actually, it's a lot of work to go on that trip. And it's really not a vacation. And people just have a hard time conceptualizing what the chief does. And so, yes, at the prime event, people will stay for hours. One thing I found through writing the paper in preparation, I spoke to dozens of chiefs of staff, and since then have spoken to hundreds of chiefs of staff. People saying, yes, that's it. Thank you. And for some, they picked up new practices or new ideas to bring into their own work life or home life. But for most of them, it was just simply an acknowledgement that, oh, there are other people in this position who face similar challenges.
I think there was a particularly interesting paragraph that you had in your article that really stuck out to me. And when I read it, I was like, yes, this is exactly what it is. And the paragraph is, confusion around this role may result in pushback from those in the C-suite who see the chief of staff as a possible barrier to communication with the CEO. The staff might fear losing influence with the CEO and have uncertainty about their standing in the organization. This fear can easily be projected upon the chief of staff and lead to a creation of walls that hamper communication. Some staff members even outright express to the chief of staff, I don't think we needed you. And this kind of straddles both the job description as well as the loneliness line, because you're kind of sitting here in the middle and knowing that you're doing so many different things that most people don't even realize that you're doing. But then you have a whole group of people who are actually important people in your organization saying, why are you even here in the first place?
Right.
And so,
right.
Now when you talk to chiefs of staff and they're telling you all these things, and I can imagine a lot of these conversations are people venting to you saying, this is my life. I like my job, but it's so hard and it's so lonely. No one knows what I'm doing. What is it that you tell them? What kind of advice would you have for people in this situation?
I think the key to any successful chief of staff is they have to have two really strong qualities. And one is an emotional intelligence, and the other is a social intelligence. And just to parse them apart a little bit, and we use emotional intelligence a lot these days. Emotional intelligence, as I understand it, is really knowing my own feelings and emotions and being able to work with them, to moderate them, to regulate them. Social intelligence is being able to sense and detect others and how they're feeling and how they're operating in the world and help manage those. And I think it's really the key of those two for a successful chief of staff. And so part of how they navigate being not lonely, because they're always often surrounded by people. It's not a number of people. It's just a sense of, do you understand what I do and do I understand what I do? Part of it is creating connections with others, with developing trust, with having a good sense of self-emotional intelligence, a good sense of others, that social intelligence, and finding that place where we can communicate in a real healthy way. In a healthy way, the foundational part of that health is trust and building the trust. Part of that is the responsibility of the chief of staff. Part is the responsibility of the exec. And sometimes we see that execs bring on a chief of staff and are real fuzzy about that position. Who is that person? What are they going to be doing? And doesn't make it clear. That can be really tricky to navigate, because that's typically the exec's discomfort with communication, the exec's discomfort with holding his or her own place in the world and feeling a little bit insecure in their role. Because I find that once they do feel secure in their role, they're able to say, this is my chief of staff. This is what they do. And it really establishes that chief in that role. So crucial for the exec to really be championing this position.
And you brought up a good point there on the element of trust within this role. And you almost know immediately that trust is such a huge component as soon as you walk onto the job. And for a lot of people, they're walking onto the job. They don't quite even know what they are supposed to be doing as a chief of staff. And then also you're expected to really get to know your boss and the other team members, how people work, what they're motivated by, how they communicate. But ultimately that your boss has the confidence in you that you will be their kind of thought partner, an extension of themselves as the CEO, the most important person in the organization. And so building that trust in the beginning, I know I found it daunting, and I know for other chiefs of staff, it can be daunting. How does one build that kind of trust in the beginning when you're so excited about the role, but there just really isn't any framework for it?
Well, I think for one thing, it's coming in with a curious mind. Some chiefs of staff walk in assuming that this is what I'm doing, and boom, I already have this authority. And technically, they might have that authority, but if they come in with a learner's mind, with a curious mind, they create relationships where they actually earn the authority as well as have the assigned authority. I think having open communication with the exec is key. So what are your needs? And really checking in, proactively checking in, not just waiting to hear, oh, they don't like what I'm doing, they love what I'm doing, whatever it might be, but to say, hey, here's what I'm doing. And how does this feel for you? Where do you need more of me? Where do you need less of me? And to really feel out, because you can go from one chief executive job to another chief executive job and have a totally different experience based on the culture of the organization, based on the personality of the exec. One thing I found important is that there's a ramping up period for a chief of staff. It doesn't just happen. And so if the exec and the chief of staff and the staff have a good understanding of this person's getting up to speed, and by this month we'll be doing this, and maybe by this month we'll be doing this. If we can get the doings kind of in order, then the beings can shift as well.
I'm sure you have so many different stories of speaking with chiefs of staff. And especially kind of when you're in this interview and thought collection process, what it means to be a chief of staff on a really internal basis. You know, what is it that we feel as a chief of staff? And I don't think anybody has really quite dug into it as deeply, especially on a mental and emotional basis as you have, Ted. And so I'm curious as to, were there any surprising things that came along the way, or were there any specific striking things that you learned in this process?
Well, actually, that's what drew me to this group, because my real deep interest is how do we hold a grounded place during a time of chaos, during a time of disruption, during a time of change. And speaking with chiefs, I found many things that they do to stay grounded. I mean, you know, we level, like I can make it through this 12-hour workday, the 16-hour workday, and come back the next day and be ready for all the fires that I need to put out or all the work I need to do within this space. There are many chiefs of staff who naturally have that. What I found is that many of them developed it as a child. And I'm exploring more in this area of what was your childhood like and how did that really inform your success as a chief of staff. But they learned to be grounded. They learned to be okay with disruption and chaos, sometimes in the home, sometimes in other formative parts of life. And there are ways to develop this muscle as well. So for some, it's meditation. They need some time for meditation every day. They need some time for reading every day. They need some time to take care of themselves every day. And this is one of the huge challenges. So holding space during that time is something we can build. I train people in different modalities, whether it comes from Kundalini Yoga or Iron Shirt Qigong or other modalities, really help us strengthen our nervous system so that we can handle all the disruption. But one thing I found, and I find this in other areas as well, is that people who are really grounded and hold this space, many of them burn out, quite frankly, because they hold this space all day and they've got the exec, right? They're making sure they've got the notes that they need for the next meeting. They're going to stand in there for another meeting. They're going to arrange different things. They're going to work on projects. They've got this. And then they go home and they're still in that mode of, okay, I'm holding space. And it might be parenting. It might be the relationship they have with a partner. It might be that they live on their own and they're still in this rigid space and they haven't figured out that they need to flow also. And that has been the most eye-opening experience for me in all of this, is the importance of getting into their flow, the importance of letting go of that grounded space and finding a time that they can let go. And this means different things for different people. Sometimes my prescription is just go dance, just go let your body go free so that they can nourish themselves, so they can come back the next day. This really leads me to my whole understanding of the role of a chief of staff these days. And we can order them in, or you're an operator and things like that, which are really useful, especially when you're hiring someone. My basic understanding of humanity, of human beings, is that we're the container and we're flow. We're both of these things, right? We have a body that's our container, and inside we have hormones and blood, and we have all kinds of things that are flowing. We have emotions and feelings and all kinds of things like that. The chief of staff, when they're really successful, it's because they are an excellent container. They're a container that's strong. It has a structural integrity, and that gives the exec a chance to flow, the exec a chance to be in their brilliance. But as container, they need to be able to lead and find their own genius, be able to flow in that way. So it's finding that balance in life. And that's what most of my training is around. It's about strengthening container and then flow. Because we need both in our bodies, we need both in our relationships.
It's so funny when I talk to other chiefs of staff about how they find time to relax. And they oftentimes, by the time I get home and I deal with all my other personal things, whether it's putting my kids to bed or having dinner with my husband or wife, it's already time to go to bed and there's no time for compression. Whenever someone says there's no time for something, it's a matter of prioritization, which is related to habit forming. And so as a chief of staff, you know that there are certain moments where you feel burnt out and you're tired and you're stressed and you're starting to wonder, why am I even doing this in the first place? But you enjoy it. A lot of chief of staff that I talk to, even though they're burnt out and they're miserable, they find so much joy and satisfaction knowing that if it weren't for them, something that day wouldn't have been able to get done, maybe at all, or maybe in the way that it did, because they were able to really connect the dots in a very special way that only they can do.
But how long do they sit in that joy, right? Oh, wow, this is great that we were able to do this because I put this all together and I'm going to just feel it through my body. I'm going to feel, wow, this is what celebration feels like, even if it's for 30 seconds. Or is it, oh, that's great. Okay, we got to move on. That doesn't rejuvenate you. You still get burned out. Right.
And so how do you start forming habits to really be in a state of mind where you can reach the flow that you're talking about and really turn it off in a lot of ways? And I think the argument that most chiefs of staff would make is that there is no time, but it's so necessary. None of us want to feel burnt out. And so how can we start building these spaces within our own minds as well as even physical spaces to really reach that sense of peace in a lot of ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. If we could take the same honor that we give to those execs and give it to ourselves, I think that's the starting place. Look, I am of value here also. And the way for me to be most successful is for me to create a container for my own flow. What does that container look like? I don't know. I was speaking to one chief of staff who is in education, higher education. Every day, he's created this space where he just walks around campus, campus for like half an hour. It's not a tremendous amount of time, but it's a beautiful green campus and he just enjoys being in nature. And so he structured it, right? That time is very structured, but he structures it so that he can flow. Many people say, I just don't have time. When I dig down in, I find that's actually not true. They do have time. They're sometimes just embarrassed to take it, or they feel inhibited, like I'm not allowed to do this. I mean, they are allowed, but they feel like they're not allowed. Like there's a sense like we have to keep working because that's what I do. Or that's how I started here 3 months ago. I can't let that down, or they're not going to love me anymore. Maybe not in those terms, but that's the feelings that are going through them. And the way we build trust with someone is that we share those vulnerabilities. I trust you more when you say to me, hey, I need 20 minutes. Rather than, man, she's looking kind of frazzled over there, but she's not saying anything. Okay, we're just keep going. You know, say, hey, I have feelings too. I'm a human being over here. The more together I am, the more I can support you. And people get that. It's our own stories that tell us, oh, we can't do that. Oh, I can't take some time off. I have this one work ethic that I was taught as a child. I can't change that. And actually we can. And when we do, and we do it consciously, and we do it transparently, it builds trust. We're trying to sneak it in. That doesn't work.
You brought this up a little bit earlier where I know I struggle with this, is chiefs of staff oftentimes, we have to have all the answers. Because when your boss asks, what's happening with this? What happened with this? How are we going to solve for this? You have to have the answers. Our mentality is that we have to, at all times, have something to say about whatever the situation is, whether it's positive or negative. And when you start bringing that into your personal life, you develop a fear of not having the answers. And even if it's your friend or your partner who's asking you a question and you feel like you don't have the answers, you almost start choking up because you're like, now what do I do? But it's okay, obviously, to not have the answers, but be able to toggle between those two lines and that fear. I see so many chiefs of staff, and I think it comes out of this inherent, we have type A personality traits. We like being perfectionists. We like being the strong person, but that doesn't mean that it's always healthy.
I want to play with that word a little bit, that we have to have the answers. Maybe not the word, but the phrase. I think chiefs need to have access to the answers. There's no possible way to have every single answer. We're not scripted for TV, right? Where where the chief of staff comes out in the TV show and boom, 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 they have all these brilliant things. We need to have access. We need to know where to find those answers, or to, if we don't know, to figure out the way to find them. But what our exec is asking and what our partner at home is asking is really the same thing. It's not, do you have the answer for me, but are you conscious over here? Are you a thought partner with me, or any kind of partner with me, or are you unconscious? And most of us slip into unconsciousness, right? We pick up our phone. We get distracted by whatever we're distracted by. I mean, if you think about relationships, that's the key to building trust. Are you here with me? You're sitting across the dining room table from me, right? We have this beautiful romantic dinner, perhaps, but it's not so romantic because you're thinking about something else, and I can tell. It's the same thing in any relationship. This is all relationship work. My training, my path is as a rabbi, and working with wedding couples, and I continue to do couple relationships and other kinds of relationships in and outside of work, and it's really all the same. It's all building trust through consciousness. I see you here. I may not have that answer for you, but I'll get that answer for you. And my integrity is such that I'll make sure I get that answer for you. And maybe even the next time it comes around, I'll have prepared that in advance. So that's the thing we're working with here.
I want to start wrapping up here, but it's hard to, because you're delving into the areas that most people don't even really talk about or think about. Yes, but we all
that's
should.
That's the fun part for me. I love that part.
And I guess one thing is, I think for chiefs of staff, we live in this world where, again, going back to having this level of consciousness is directly related to having a level of certainty of the things that you know, the information that you have, the access to the information that you have. But then it also relates to the certainty over your own path and your own journey. And I think for chiefs of staff, when you're running around all day doing all these crazy things, it doesn't always allow for a whole lot of time, or at least in your mind, you don't have that much time to think about your own path and your own future journey. What will life after being a chief of staff really look like? And therefore, I've seen a lot of chiefs of staff feel insecure, feel that they don't have as much value because there's no clear next path for them. Sometimes they feel like, how do I translate all the things that I'm doing now into my next thing? Because it's so hard to summarize everything that I do because I do so much. What do you say to those that feel this kind of anxiety, this level of uncertainty about their own path, even though they enjoy what they do now, they know it's important, they know that they have access to a lot of different people and information? How do you think about dealing with uncertainty of the future?
I love that question. Change is the only thing we can count on, right? In our future. I think that first, let me say that it's time for a chief of staff to move on when either they can no longer hold that container for the genius and the flow of the exec, or they feel like their own genius needs to come out. Okay, I've held that space for this person, but I've got something bubbling inside of me that says that there's something else to come out. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's, oh, I want to move to lead this department within the organization. Sometimes it's, oh, I've always wanted to do this. Now I have the facility. I have the technical tools to create this over here. Sometimes it's important just to sit in this position without having another position to jump into. And I get that can be scary, but often that's the best place to go, is to sit really in silence. As my teacher would say, sit in the mud for a little while until you see what emerges. And I would also counsel it's a time to get a coach. It's a time to get someone who can challenge you a little bit, who can question your answers, and who can answer your questions. But someone who can really guide you through. It's almost as if midwifing you through this transition from one life into this life you can't even imagine. What I find is that when you find that person, that coach, together, you create something that you never imagined before. You open new doors. A chief of staff who's successful in that role is going to be successful in lots of roles. Matter of finding what lights them up. And finding what lights them up, poof, real beauty happens.
Well, there you have it. Find the thing that lights you up. You know, that in and of itself gave me my own confidence. I was like, I feel lit up now.
Yeah.
No, Ted, what you shared today was extremely valuable. Your perspective and what you've been able to really intensely pick up on over the last many months that you've studied and talked to and interviewed in a really careful and thoughtful way, specifically on chiefs of staff, is such a service. And I really appreciate you sharing all your interesting findings. And I'm sure there'll be plenty more findings. And, you know, chiefs of staff would be lucky to obviously have a coach like you. I've had many wonderful conversations with you that have helped me tremendously along my own journey. So I appreciate everything that you're doing, Ted, and I appreciate you sharing on this podcast some of your own thoughts and findings.
Well, you are welcome, Caroline. It's been my pleasure. I always love talking to you, and I love talking about the subject. So thank you. Appreciate the invitation.
Thanks for listening to the Chief of Staff Collective podcast. You can hear us on your favorite podcast app every other Monday. Make sure you subscribe, rate, and review so you don't miss an episode.